Jesus starts off tonight with, "Are you shocked by what I'm telling you? What I told you about the bread that I'm giving you being my flesh and the wine that I'm giving you being my blood, does that shock you?" They were more than shocked. They were disgusted. They were revolted. And some of that we would understand better if we knew more about the Jewish religion at that time. Remember, this is the religion that has dietary laws. So what you eat and the way you go about it is very, very important. But even if you don't know that whole history, it is still shocking. If you have a non-Catholic friend who has ever asked you, do you guys really believe that? Do you really believe that it's his actual body and blood? Many of us have had conversations with people like that. And according to one study not that long ago, up to 70% of Catholics have a hard time believing it. Up to 70% of Catholics say, I really like to see it more as a symbol. I don't like all that flesh and blood talk. But I have two stories for you tonight about people who took Jesus at his word. One of them is a former pastor of this church. In 1932, there was a fire in this church. I never knew that until Tommy Burke told me. And if you don't like any of the details of this story, take it up with Tommy Burke. So the story is that it was 1932. The church at that time was about 30 years old, and it was in need of its first ever spruce up. And so Father Phibbs, the famous pastor at that time, who was pastor here for 30 years. Does anybody remember Father Phibbs? Does anybody remember him? Father Phibbs decided that it would be a good thing during the Great Depression to hire some workers to paint the church. It would be work for them, and it would help the church that was 30 years old to look a little fresher. Now, it's unclear how the fire started because it was a time of a lot of anti-Catholic feeling in the area and in this town, so there was some worry that it might have been a malicious fire. But leaving that aside, a bunch of rags downstairs in Maria Hall caught on fire, and they were paint-soaked rags, so the fire burned pretty hot. And the fire came up through the floor, and it singed this whole wall, and it burned the 14th station of the cross, where you see the flowers and the candles today. It was not discovered, the fire, until just after midnight. A bread delivery driver was coming through town and saw a glow through that window. And so he knew where to go. He drove straight down the hill, down the street, to the Knights of Columbus Hall, which at that time was upstairs in the Maritza building across from the Dolan block. The bread delivery guy knew that the Knights of Columbus were always playing euchre late into the night. He went down, he said, "There's a fire in the church." They came up. They woke up Father Phibbs next door, and it was a pretty bad fire. They started putting water on it right away, and the fire department came, and they got it out. And the story goes that Jerry Mizraca, who, this is several generations ago, so he's known around town apparently as Old Jerry. Again, if you don't like that name, sorry, Mizraca family, that's what Tommy Burke said. Old Jerry Mizraca said to Father Phibbs, "Father, do you want any help getting the Eucharist out of the church?" The Eucharist he was referring to was the reserved Eucharist in the tabernacle right there. And Father Phibbs said, "No, Jerry, we're going to keep the Eucharist where it is and let it work for us tonight." Father Phibbs believed that the Eucharist had supernatural power, that it was not a symbol, that it was not something nice, something to bring people together, not something to do before you leave Mass. He really believed that it was, although it looked like bread, divine flesh. And that if it were here, it had special power to protect the church that was not here without it. He took Jesus at his word. The Eucharist, we always hear, is the center of our faith. And so the story about Father Phibbs is about one part of that. There are endless aspects to the Eucharist, but one important part of it is that receiving the Eucharist is how we get God's supernatural power and protection in our lives. It is how we wind up being encircled with God everywhere we go. It's how we place God at the center of our lives, the way the tabernacle is in the center of the sanctuary. But also, the way we show respect to the Eucharist, the way we love and respect the Eucharist, is one of the best ways that we can show Jesus' love directly. Because to love the Eucharist is to love him in a very intimate, tender way. Growing up in Rochester, I learned from an early age about what respect for the Eucharist looked like. And the story I'm about to tell you is about another church fire, but it was very different. It was years after the one here at St. Mary's. It was actually in 1967. Father George Weinmann was the pastor at St. Philip Neri Church in the northeast part of Rochester. And if you have any connections there, it's up near Irondequoit. And there was a parish school there, and Sister Lillian Marie McLoughlin was only 26 years old. She was a young nun, and she worked at the parish school. She was a second grade teacher. And on one afternoon, February 20th, 1967, the kids were in the recess schoolyard, and they saw the church roof with flames shooting out of it. So they started screaming. So Sister called the fire department, and then Father George came down the stairs in his socks, and both of them ran into the church thinking that there might be some children inside. There were no kids inside, but while they were inside, they said, "Let's get the Eucharist. We don't want the Eucharist to be burned." So they were found when the fire department was putting out the flames. They were just a few feet from the front door. They had gotten the door to the confessional mixed up with the door to the church in all of the smoke. And the smoke was especially thick because they had just that week polished all of the pews with lemon oil. The Eucharist was in their hands. Father George had the ciborium, the lidded chalice with the Eucharist, and she had a bowl. That is where they died, trying to rescue the Eucharist. I think a good response to that story is exactly how Jesus responded to the people's reaction. Does that shock you? Does it shock you that a 26-year-old nun and a 77-year-old priest would regard the bread in the tabernacle the way they would regard a child in danger in a burning building? Does it shock you that someone would die to save the Eucharist? Is it something you would do? I think stories like this bring up lots of questions for us. It's a strong story, and it's meant to be something that we really cling to. Jesus wasn't saying this to get more followers or to be popular. He was really challenging them. And the two stories we've just shared today are similar in that way. What does the Eucharist mean to me? Is a good question for hearing stories like that. What does it mean? Father Phibbs left the Eucharist in the tabernacle because he said, "I think tonight is a night we need the Eucharist to work for us." What does that mean to you? What does the Eucharist do in your life? What work does it do in your life? Father George and Sister Lillian Marie regarded the Eucharist as a child that was in trouble in a burning church. Would you have gone that far? What lengths of respect and reverence would you show? Hearing stories like this, I think, brings to a lot of our minds what we've been hearing on the news, that there's a lot of debate and conflict over the Eucharist. There's a lot of talk, even in the secular media, about who should get the Eucharist and who shouldn't. And I hear from a lot of parishioners that it leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths because it's more sacred than that. It shouldn't be talked about that way in the news. It makes it an object. when it's really the Lord? How do you feel about Jesus being referred to that way in the Eucharist? All of us are faced with this as we continue dealing with COVID, because there's a lot of folks out there on the live stream right now that have not been to the church and to receive the Eucharist in 18 months. And a lot of us are kind of deciding, if this variant gets worse, what will I do about that? If we have live stream Mass, we have a lot. We have a lot. And it's got a lot of benefits, but there is no Eucharist with it. How do I feel about that? How hungry is my faith when I don't have the Eucharist? The fact that 70% of Catholics don't really feel comfortable believing that it's true flesh and true blood reminds us of what was said in the gospel today. Lord, this saying is hard. Who's supposed to accept this? But Jesus responds to them the way he responds to us. The fact that it's hard to accept, is that going to drive you away? Have I gone farther than you can go with me? Have I taken it a step too far for you? Peter's response to that was, Lord, where would we go? It's you. It's only you. It's always only been you. Let's see if we can bring that kind of love to this altar tonight.